Hey, so I'm talking about the Adventure Zone again, only this time it's about the graphic novel Here There Be Gerblins, which is an adaptation of the first adventure from the Balance arc of the same name. It's mostly written by Clint McElroy, who is actually an experienced ghostwriter of previous books and comics, though the rest of the McElroy brothers are mentioned kind of like as the people who did help create this story as the podcast went along. But from what I've heard from the podcast, Clint is the primary writer of this book. And the art is done by Carrie Peach. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And I was really interested in this book because when listening to a different podcast, the Pretend Friends podcast, I was always thinking about like how it'd be interesting to see it as a book in a more serious light compared to the very humorous story that was being told through that podcast. And so when I heard about the book for the Adventure Zone podcast, I was very interested to see how they would adapt it. And for the most part, it was really, really good. The story is just as good as before, and I expect it to be that way going forward for all future books as well. But what really stuck out to me was just the artwork. It's really amazing, and for me, it immersed me in the story more than the podcast ever did with its audio. And if you're worried about the humor, you don't have to be. It's still very funny throughout. There are a few jokes that don't work as well in book form compared to podcast form, but for the most part, everything was adapted well enough to where it works well in a book setting and doesn't really take away from the story. That being said, there are a few negatives that I have to point out. As a heads up, I'm going to be delving into spoilers here, so if you haven't listened to or read Here There Be Gerblins yet, then I'd encourage you to go do it now. That being said, let's get into what I felt were the weakest parts of the book. First of all, there were a few name changes here. This is due largely in part to the fact that they started off playing the Lost Mine of Phandelver campaign, and as a result, a lot of the characters and locations are named after those objects within the campaign. So they didn't actually own the rights to those names, and I guess because it was a monetized medium that they were releasing this time around, they didn't have the rights to use those names for those places and characters. For example, Clarg is changed his name to Nash, Phandalin is called Haverdale, and Gundren Rockseeker is called Bogard Stoneseeker. Their names are somewhat similar for Gundren, for instance, but Haverdale and Nash are not the same. And for someone who has listened to the entire podcast now, going back and reading the book, I expect to hear these names, but when I see the new names, I'm kind of caught off guard. And especially for Phandalin, every time I see Haverdale, I keep trying to remember, wait, what are they talking about? It's like, oh wait, they're talking about Phandalin. And especially for Phandalin, it's going to be a major issue going on, because Phandalin is a major influencer for what Taco, Merle, and Magnus end up doing in the future arcs. It's a very driving part of their character. They feel kind of responsible for what happened there. And so the name of Phandalin is brought up several times in the future. However, in the book, it's going to be called Haverdale every time. And every time it's brought up, I'm going to be caught off guard and be like, wait, what are they talking about? Oh, right, Phandalin. And it's going to take me out of the moment. And for me, that's going to be a major detractor from some of my enjoyment a little bit. Clarg does show up a little bit more after that, and so hearing Nash is going to be a bit of an inconvenience as well, but he isn't as big of a part in the story as Phandalin, and as a result, it won't have as big an effect. So it may just be a minor inconvenience for me personally, but I really don't like it. Another change they made is that they took out a few minor moments in the story, or just cut down certain segments for the sake of pacing. And for the most part, it all just really kind of goes really well. The only one I have an issue with is the removal of Kurtz. It's a pretty big removable because it affects how the ending to Phandalin takes place. In the original podcast, Kurtz is a orc who was being captured and was going to be sold into slavery, but the group just chose to save him before going off to Phandalin to stop Gundren. And as a result, Kurtz, feeling anger towards Gundren for killing his fellow orcs, shoots him with an arrow before they manage to get the glove off of him, which ultimately sends him into the rage that destroys Phandalin. In the book, Kurtz is not included at all, and instead, the reason why Gundren decides to destroy the village in his rage is because Barry tries to remove the glove while Merle is trying to do it through a more peaceful manner. And so, while I do understand kind of why this was removed, like, it is a bit of a strange pacing decision to make. Like, we gotta go save the village of Phandalin. Oh, but first let's go save this orc who's being captured and sold into slavery. Like, it is a very strange thing to do for pacing, and I think it does make the story flow better, but it does, for me, weaken the motivations of the characters. Because even though it ultimately is Kurtz's fault that Phandalin is destroyed, it wouldn't have been possible had Taco, Merle, and Magnus not saved him in the first place. And to me, it always felt like that was the main reason why Phandalin drove them, because like they felt indirectly responsible for its destruction. In this instance, like they are shown to kind of egg Barry on to go do what he does, but that's hardly anything. Like, sure, they do feel like they're kind of like responsible, like they were going to try and save Phandalin and they failed, but the motivation just feels weaker in this instance. The last thing I want to bring up is my personal least favorite aspect of the story, and that's that they included Griffin as a character. Now, at first, I kinda was okay with the decision. It was a little bit, he was making some funny jokes, and it kind of made the story a little bit more enjoyable at the beginning. But as it went on, I kind of started to see the problems with this decision. By including Griffin as a character, the other characters in the story, Taco, Merle, and Magnus, knew about his existence, and as a result, kind of broke the fourth wall with him a little bit, and it makes the immersion feel a little less. Like, before, I thought this was going to be kind of a slightly more serious version of the story that didn't really involve any of that fourth wall breaking or any of those kinds of jokes, and that it would be a much more immersive story because the D&D podcast aspect of it would not be present. But instead, I guess as a way to try and include Griffin in the story, they wanted to give him a part. And while I do understand that, it just seems like a misstep. Like, this is an opportunity to tell a more serious version of the story without the limitations of the podcast element. But by including Griffin, it just kind of takes that away, and whenever he pops up, it takes away my immersion as well, because it's like, this is a very serious moment, and suddenly he pops in to say something, and it's either like a joke, or he's just trying to make a statement about something, and it's like, it's not necessary. And especially at the end, when Phandalin is destroyed, there's a scene where the group, like, are in the well, and they kind of start laughing because, like, they feel like they failed miserably, and like it's before they actually climb out and see just how bad it is. Like, they kind of just laugh at, like, wow, we really screwed up. But then Griffin is shown laughing with them in this scene, and it's like, why is he laughing? Like, it makes sense for the group to do it because like they don't fully understand just how bad it is, but the game master does. And even more than that, he knows that this village had a few, like, characters in it that ended up affecting other characters down the line, and that the destruction of Phandalin is a big part of kind of what's going to happen later. And to me, it feels really wrong for the game master to be included in this scene. That being said, I'm still going to read every future book that comes out. However, I'm probably not going to make a video on them because, for the most part, I'm pretty sure it's just going to be the exact same as what I stated here. The story will just be as good as it was in the podcast, the art's going to be amazing, and it's going to be a very funny read. there will be maybe a few minor changes in the stories for pacing reasons, and maybe the occasional large change, and if it's a big enough change I might mention it, but chances are I don't really expect that to happen. And Griffin also will still be part of the story. Maybe they will reduce his the amount he's in the story in future books, but ultimately his inclusion is going to be a detractor for me. The only thing that that shouldn't be in any future books is the changing of names, because after Here There Be Gerblins, everything was original, at least according to Griffin. If anything was actually taken from somewhere else, and he has to make a change because of that legal reason, then I guess that'll end up happening, but for the most part, I don't see that happening at all. The only video I might expect to make is on the third book, Pedals to the Metal, which is going to include the scene that I mentioned in my previous video that I really despised, and just to see, like, depending on what happens in the book, I will either make a video about it, or I will just kind of maybe just not talk about it at all. Maybe at the very end, I might do like a whole retrospective thing about the entire book saga, but chances are this is just going to be my last video on the Adventure Zone. I may leave written reviews for the books on the sites that are sold on, like at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or maybe their own website, but other than that, this will be the last you hear about these books. If you're interested in checking out the Adventure Zone, you can listen to the podcast at MaximumFun.org, or you can get the book at wherever books are sold, or online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or IndieBound. I'll leave links in the description for you if you want to check it out. Other than that, that's it for me on the Adventure Zone. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you whenever I make next.